The storm advanced silently across the horizon, painting the sky grey and casting a dull light over the wet asphalt. In the middle of a secondary road, isolated among vast fields of wheat dormant under the winter's chill, a majestic car stood still, immobilized by the unforeseen force of nature and a sudden engine failure. It was a classic Mustang, impeccably restored, with the sheen of the past reflected in every metallic curve, but at that moment it seemed defeated by the loneliness of that deserted landscape. From the driver's seat, a man in a burgundy suit and a cold demeanor stepped out, his expensive shoe sinking discreetly into the mud, while the relentless wind made the dry leaves dance across the roadside. He looked at the hood with a mix of frustration and resignation, pulling a cell phone from his coat pocket that, to his misfortune, caught no signal in that forgotten stretch untouched by progress. The man, known to many as a discreet and unattainable millionaire, now found himself as vulnerable as anyone else. His eyes, so accustomed to contracts, figures, and meetings where nothing was ever lacking, reflected for the first time in a long while genuine discomfort, an existential void that seemed to echo the silent resonance of that abandoned road. His name was Richard Lancaster. At 52, he was a man whose biography filled business magazines and prestigious profiles, a successful entrepreneur, a shrewd investor, the owner of an international chain of luxury hotels, nightclubs, and starred restaurants. But none of those titles, collected like cold, lifeless trophies, filled the absence that consumed him from within. The absence of a child he never had, of a wife who had left before they could discover that life could be shared in its fullness, of a childhood stolen by an alcoholic father and a mother too silent to protect him. Richard closed the Mustang's hood with a heavy sigh, shoved his hands into his pockets, and cast a glance around as if searching the vastness for help he knew wouldn't come. And yet, amid the distant rumble of thunder and the dance of leaves swept by the wind, a delicate, almost fragile voice made itself heard. "Sir, do you need help?" He turned, startled by the sudden presence, and saw, a few meters away, a frail little girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with blonde hair loosely tied by a faded ribbon, wearing a coat clearly too large for her frame and boots that seemed to have weathered more winters than she could count. She clutched a paper bag tightly, from which a small, rusty but meticulously organized toolbox peeked out. Richard, with a furrowed brow, took a few seconds to process the scene, which felt more like a delirium caused by exhaustion or the isolation of that nameless road. "No need, little one. I'm waiting for help." She tilted her head, narrowing her eyes with the cunning only children raised in scarcity can develop. "There's no signal here. No one's passing by for hours. This road only sees traffic when Mr. Wilson's tractor heads to the village, and he's not coming today. It's raining." Richard swallowed hard, as if the girl's words effortlessly stripped away the fragile hope he still held for a quick solution. "And you? What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone unintentionally sharp. The girl gave a half smile, as if already used to dealing with wary adults. "I live over there, see?" she said, pointing with her chin to a simple house almost invisible among the bare trees about 300 meters away. "I was going to fetch some eggs with my mom from the farm on the other side, but I saw you stopped here and came to check if you needed help." She then raised the paper bag. "My grandpa taught me how to fix cars. Can I try?" Richard hesitated. The idea seemed absurd, almost comical. A little girl, her small hands hidden in the oversized sleeves of her coat, offering to fix the Mustang he'd just acquired at a $1 million auction. But there was something about her, perhaps her lack of fear or the calm confidence in her voice, that kept him from dismissing her outright. "What's your name?" he asked finally. "Emily," she replied simply, extending her hand. He shook it gently, noting that her fingers were cold and rough, calloused like those of someone who'd known hard work from an early age. "Richard," he responded, almost surprised at how naturally he shared his name. Emily then walked to the Mustang, set the bag on the ground, and with the ease of someone who'd repeated the gesture for years, lifted the hood and propped it open. Richard watched, almost hypnotized, as she examined the engine with a focused gaze, touching here and there with her fingertips, unhurried but precise. He wasn't sure what was more astonishing, her evident skill or the serenity of this girl facing a car that many experienced mechanics would hesitate to touch without manuals or instructions. And it was at that moment, as she leaned in to reach one of the inner components, that Richard noticed something that made him catch his breath. On her left hand, delicately fitted on her ring finger, was a simple silver ring, unmistakable. He knew that design, not because it was a rare jewel, but because it was the exact same one he'd given, nearly 3 decades ago, to the only woman he'd ever loved, a silent promise that had never been fulfilled. His eyes fixed on that small silver circle, as if time had stopped, frozen by a possibility he didn't dare name. Emily, oblivious to his reaction, remained focused on the engine, while Richard felt his heart race in a way he hadn't experienced since the days when he still believed love could in fact fix everything. He took a step forward almost impulsively and asked, his voice trembling, "That ring, where did you get it?" Emily looked up, surprised by the sudden question, then glanced at the ring as if only now noticing its presence. "Oh, this? It was my mom's. She always wore it. Said it was important, but never explained much. Just asked me to never take it off." Richard's world spun. Her words echoed like thunder, louder than any storm the sky could unleash. He stepped back, grasping for air, while the girl, unaware of the turmoil she'd sparked, returned to adjusting the tool on the engine. The ring, the mother, the promise, the lost time. Everything seemed to converge in that scene, so improbable it felt scripted by a force beyond human logic. And for the first time in years, Richard felt something break within him. An invisible armor, forged by years of fear, pain, and distance, began, slowly, to crumble. Richard stood there motionless, as the cold seemed to pierce not just his skin but every layer of his long, hardened soul. The metallic clink of Emily's tools sounded like a distant soundtrack, drowned out by the torrent of thoughts swirling inside him. The ring. How could it be? Nearly 30 years ago he had placed it on Sophie's finger on a sunny autumn afternoon under a tree that might no longer exist. And then everything fell apart. Youthful impulsiveness, the pursuit of success, choices that seemed inevitable but now, in hindsight, felt like mere excuses for his cowardice. And Sophie, she had vanished from his life, taking with her the purest part of him, his ability to love without reservation. He took a hesitant step, as if fearing to tread on sacred ground, and leaned slightly over the hood. "Your mother, what's her name?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but his voice betrayed his anxiety. Emily bit her lower lip, thoughtful, as she adjusted one final piece and, with a firm twist, tightened the screw that sealed her repair attempt. "Sophie Lancaster," she replied, without looking up, as if the name were just another trivial piece of information. But to Richard it sounded like the loudest thunderclap. He stumbled back 2 steps, as if the ground had opened beneath him. Sophie, the surname, the same as his. Had she not changed her name? Or had she kept it to preserve a memory? Or perhaps to protect their daughter? Richard's gaze wandered to the foggy horizon, searching in vain for answers only the past could provide. His chest ached, as if each heartbeat were a punch against the wall of regrets he'd carefully built to shield himself from everything now surging forth with violence. Emily, meanwhile, wiped her hands with a worn cloth she pulled from her jacket pocket. She looked at him with the ease of someone who, though so young, had already learned to handle adults' indifference or astonishment. "I think you can try starting it now," she said, pointing to the car. Richard, still dazed, nodded and got into the Mustang. He turned the key, and as if blessed by a breath of redemption, the engine roared to life, filling the empty road with the vibrant sound of life pulsing again. He turned off the car, stepped out, and stood before the girl, unsure of what to say. I don't know how to thank you," he stammered. Emily shrugged, smiling. "I just do what my grandpa taught me." He smiled, but the smile quickly faded under the urgent need to understand more. "Your grandfather, where is he?" She pointed again to the little house among the trees. "We live there. He's sick. My mum takes care of him." Richard took a deep breath. The cold air felt sharp. He felt drawn toward that direction by an invisible force, as if a thread, long broken, was finally being rewoven. "Would you mind if I went there?" he asked, his voice choked. Emily raised her eyebrows, surprised, but soon nodded, picking up her bag and starting down the dirt path toward the house. Richard followed in silence, each step echoing memories he thought were buried. The house was simple, made of weathered wood, with a modest porch and wildflowers stubbornly growing among the path stones. When they reached the door, Emily turned to him. "You can come in, but speak quietly. My grandpa's resting." Richard stepped inside, removing his wet coat and hanging it on a nail in the wall, instinctively respecting the intimacy of that home that so absurdly felt familiar. The scent of chamomile tea mingled with the smell of burning firewood, warming the space against the relentless cold outside. Emily walked to one of the rooms and with care called out, "Mom, there's a man here." Richard stood in the living room, observing the old photographs hanging on the walls. Most were black and white or faded by time, showing a young, smiling woman holding a small child, with a rural landscape vaguely resembling this place in the background. He approached one of the frames, and when his eyes focused on the details, felt the ground vanish beneath him. There was Sophie, younger, with the same sweet smile he could never forget, holding a baby in her arms. That baby could only be Emily. He heard soft footsteps approaching, and when he turned, there she was. Sophie, now more mature, her once golden hair streaked with silver, her eyes still marked by that unique blend of sweetness and strength. She stopped at the door, holding a dish towel between her hands, and when their eyes met, neither could utter a word. Silence settled, dense, heavy, laden with everything left unsaid over the years. Sophie brought her hand to her mouth, as if trying to stifle a sob, while Richard, eyes brimming, took a step forward. "Sophie," he said with difficulty. She nodded, taking a deep breath, fighting the torrent of emotions. "Richard." Her voice was the same, just huskier, more marked by life, but essentially unchanged. For a moment they stood there, motionless, as if needing time to believe this was real. Emily, not fully grasping the scene, looked from one to the other until she finally broke the silence. "Do you know each other?" Sophie glanced at her daughter, then at Richard, as if the question forced her to face what she'd avoided for years. "Yes," she replied, her voice trembling. "We knew each other a long time ago." Richard took a deep breath, running a hand through his wet hair, trying to organize his thoughts. He wanted to ask so much. Why she never reached out, why she never said anything, why she raised this girl alone, but he knew this wasn't the time or tone for it. "I was passing through the car," he tried to explain, but Sophie gave a half smile, as if understanding that this went far beyond a broken car. She gestured for him to sit, and in an automatic motion put water on to heat on the wood stove. "Tea?" she asked, as if time hadn't passed. Richard smiled, tears in his eyes, and nodded. "Tea." As Sophie prepared the drink, Emily sat on the floor playing with a tin toy car. Richard watched her, noting every feature, every expression, every gesture, and felt overwhelmed by a certainty that, though still unspoken, was undeniable. This girl was his daughter. He looked at Sophie again, stirring the tea with care, and thought how strange life is, capable of taking improbable turns, playing cruel tricks, but also sometimes, when least expected, offering a second chance. When she placed the cup before him, and their eyes met again, no words were needed. There was a silent understanding, an implicit promise. Their story wasn't over yet. The steam rising from the teacup seemed to dance in the air, enveloping them in an atmosphere of silent intimacy. Richard held the porcelain with both hands, as if that warmth were the anchor keeping him from sinking completely into the turbulent sea of emotions threatening to engulf his soul. Sophie, seated across from him, also cradled her cup, avoiding his gaze, focusing on the circular motion of her spoon, as if seeking in the mechanical gesture a way to organize thoughts that, like his, must have been in turmoil. Emily, oblivious to the adult tension, gently pushed the tin car across the worn rug, creating silent little narratives only she understood. The scene was disarmingly simple, but for Richard, every detail seemed laden with a symbolism greater than the life he'd led until then. He broke the silence, his voice low, as if fearing that words spoken too loudly might shatter the delicate balance established there. I didn't know," he said, finally meeting Sophie's trembling eyes. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a brief moment before answering. "I know." Once again, silence stood between them, now not as a barrier but as a bridge, allowing each to acknowledge the pains and choices that had separated them for so long. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, with more pain than accusation. Sophie set the spoon on the saucer and rubbed her hands, as if trying to rid herself of a guilt that no longer made sense to carry. "When I found out, you were already so far away, Richard. Your life was different. Our story seemed to have no place anymore. I thought it would be better this way, that I could raise Emily, without needing to turn to you. He felt a pang in his chest, as if each word were a stab. The image he'd nurtured of himself as a successful man, yet solitary by choice, crumbled before that revelation. His absence hadn't just been a comfortable void, but a real, tangible absence, marked in the lives of two people he should have protected. Sophie seemed to read his thoughts, and lightly touched his hand, a brief but sufficient gesture to anchor him to that moment. "I didn't want you to find out like this," she said, her voice choked. "I didn't want it to be this way on a forgotten road on a rainy day." Richard closed his eyes, breathing deeply, absorbing the impact of her words. "Maybe," he replied, "maybe there was no other way." Emily, sensing the gravity of the conversation, looked up, curious, but remained silent, respecting a space that even without fully understanding, she knew was important. Time seemed to have halted in that wood-warmed room. Outside, the rain intensified, turning the earth to mud and creating small puddles that reflected the bare treetops. Inside, however, another transformation was unfolding, slower, deeper, harder to name. The reunion of two souls that, despite the years, still recognized each other. Richard slipped his hand into his coat's inner pocket, pulling out his wallet. From it, among various cards and documents, he took an old, yellowed photograph. He handed it to Sophie, who took it gently. It was a picture of them, taken in a distant summer, in front of the lake where they'd spent endless afternoons laughing, dreaming, making plans that would never come to fruition. Sophie smiled, tears in her eyes. "I remember that day," she whispered. "So do I," Richard replied, his voice hoarse. She handed the photo back, but he refused with a gesture. "Keep it. I think it belongs to you. Now, more than ever." Sophie pressed the photograph to her chest, as if holding a rediscovered treasure. Emily then stood and walked to them, standing between them with a curious yet calm gaze. "Mom, who is he?" she asked, with the disarming innocence of children. Sophie and Richard exchanged a look that condensed years of absence, guilt, love, and redemption. Sophie knelt to her daughter's level, holding her hands. "Emily, this is Richard. He's your father." The words hung in the air like a silent bolt of lightning, igniting Richard's heart in a way he'd never felt before. Emily furrowed her brow, trying to process the information, while Richard felt tears burn his eyes. He knelt too, meeting his daughter's gaze, and, with a trembling voice, said, I didn't know, Emily. If I had known, I would have come. I would have been with you. Can you forgive me?" The girl, so small yet so immense, looked at him deeply, as if probing not just his words, but the soul behind them. Then, in a simple gesture that shattered the last of Richard's defenses, she threw herself into his arms, hugging him tightly. He embraced her, crying silently, feeling whole for the first time in decades. Sophie, too, was crying, joining the embrace, forming a nucleus that time, distance, and wrong choices hadn't been able to destroy completely. For minutes, they stayed like that, embraced in silence, letting love do what only it can, rebuild what seemed irreparably lost. When the embrace broke, Richard wiped his tears and looked at Sophie. "And now?" he asked, unsure of what he expected as an answer. She smiled, melancholic, but hopeful. Now life has given us a second chance." He nodded, holding Emily's hand tightly. "And I won't waste it." Sophie stood, went to the kitchen and brought a photo album. Sitting beside them again, she began flipping through the pages, showing Richard the moments he'd missed. Emily's first birthday, her first day at school, vacations at her grandparents' house, the day she learned to ride a bike. Richard listened and looked with rapt attention, as if trying to reclaim even partially the years he'd been absent. Each image, each story was a mix of joy and pain. Joy for seeing that, despite everything, Emily had been well cared for and loved. Pain for knowing he hadn't been there to share those moments. The album ended, and Sophie closed it gently, looking at him with a mix of complicity and challenge. "There's still time," she said, as if offering an opportunity, but also setting a condition. Richard smiled, feeling the weight of her words and, at the same time, the relief of realizing it wasn't an accusation but an invitation. "I know, and I want to." Emily then tugged his hand, excited. "Want to see where Grandpa plants the pumpkins?" Richard laughed, nodding. "Of course, Princess." She led him by the hand to the backyard, while Sophie watched, smiling and crying at the same time. In that moment, Richard understood that life, with all its twists, surprises, and losses, could still be generous, and sometimes it took a car breaking down on a deserted road for fate, or perhaps God, to find the perfect opportunity to reunite what never should have been separated. The backyard behind the small house was simple but brimming with life. Small vegetables competed for space with sturdy pumpkin vines sprawling across the damp soil, and a row of wilted sunflowers, resilient even in winter, flanked the weathered wooden fence. Richard walked slowly, guided by Emily's firm and confident hand, as if that land, so foreign to the world he knew, were now the most important stage of his existence. With each step, he noticed details he might have previously ignored. The birdhouse hanging from the apple tree, the clay pots with medicinal herbs, the children's galoshes left aside, still caked with dirt. Emily ran to one of the rows and, with pride, pointed to a massive, nearly ripe pumpkin. "Look, I planted this one with Grandpa." Richard crouched, running his hand over the fruit's rough surface, feeling an unexpected yet powerful connection to that simplicity. He smiled, moved. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice choked. Emily beamed, pleased with the compliment, and continued showing him other corners of the yard, as if presenting not just a physical space, but an entire universe she inhabited with familiarity and joy. As they walked, Sophie watched from the porch, arms wrapped around herself, shielding against the cold and perhaps the memories that scene evoked. Seeing them together was like watching a movie that could never be filmed, but was now astonishingly unfolding before her eyes. Richard, meanwhile, felt time slow down, as if each second there were an eternity. There were no contracts to sign, no urgent meetings, no flights to catch. There was only the smell of the earth, Emily's crystalline laughter, and Sophie's attentive gaze following his every move. "And here," said Emily, pulling him to a small makeshift greenhouse built with old glass panes, "we plant Mom's flowers. She loves daisies, but I prefer sunflowers." Richard smiled, noting how his daughter's personality shone through even in the simplest choices. "I like sunflowers too," he admitted, and Emily seemed pleased with the coincidence. They lingered there for a few minutes until, suddenly, Emily grew serious, looking at him with eyes that seemed to see beyond the visible. "You're going to leave, aren't you?" The direct, innocent question hit Richard like an arrow. He took a deep breath, kneeling to meet her gaze. I don't know. My life is complicated." Emily looked down, gently kicking the dirt with the tip of her boot. "Everyone leaves." Richard felt his chest tighten. Those words, spoken so naturally, revealed a pain no child should bear. "Emily," he began, holding her small hands, "I don't want to leave, and if I do, I promise I'll come back. I won't disappear again." She looked at him, weighing whether she could trust the promise. Then, as if deciding to believe, she smiled and hugged him tightly. In that embrace, Richard felt something he hadn't known in years: belonging. When they returned inside, Sophie was waiting with the fireplace lit, warming the space with the silent comfort only true homes offer. She watched them enter and, instinctively, pulled another chair to the table for Richard to sit. He accepted, and soon Sophie brought a tray with homemade bread, strawberry jam, and a thermos of coffee. "I made it earlier," she said, offering. Richard served himself, grateful, while Emily settled beside her mother, laughing about something she recalled doing with her grandfather. For a few minutes, the conversation revolved around simple things: the crops, the weather, the challenges of keeping everything running with limited resources. Richard listened attentively, admiring Sophie's strength and serenity. She, who had once been the dreamy young woman by his side, was now a mature woman who had raised a daughter alone and cared for a sick father, never losing her tenderness. As night fell, Sophie rose to prepare her father's room, leaving Richard and Emily alone in the living room. He watched her go upstairs, his heart heavy with longing for all they hadn't lived, but also with admiration for what she had become. Emily then pulled a sketchbook from a shelf and began showing him her drawings: houses, trees, flowers, and in many of them, a male figure alongside a woman and a girl. "That's Daddy," she explained, pointing to the man drawn with childish strokes, but full of affectionate details. Richard swallowed hard. "And who did you think of when you drew him?" Emily shrugged. "I don't know. I just wanted there to be one. Sometimes I imagined what he'd be like. Mom never talked much, but I thought he could be someone nice, who liked cars too." Richard smiled, moved. "I like cars." "I know," she replied, with the spontaneity of someone who had already accepted him, even without fully understanding him. Sophie came down the stairs, wiping her hands on her apron. "Dad's settled in, he'll rest a bit, we should too." She paused, observing the scene. Richard and Emily side by side, sharing a moment that seemed eternally awaited. "Want to stay for dinner?" she asked, her tone casual but laden with meaning. Richard smiled without hesitation. "I do." Dinner was simple: vegetable soup, homemade bread, and tea. But for Richard, it was like a feast. Each spoonful, each word exchanged, was another step toward rebuilding the bridge that had been broken for so long. After dinner, as Emily went upstairs to her room, Sophie and Richard stayed in the kitchen, washing the dishes. "You could stay," she said, almost in a whisper. Richard paused, holding a bowl, and looked at her. "You want me to stay?" Sophie took a deep breath, drying her hands, and stepped closer. "I don't know. Maybe it's too late. Maybe not." He set the bowl down and took her hands. "It's never too late, Sophie." She smiled, tears in her eyes, and hugged him. In that embrace, they both understood that love, though dormant, had never died. The clock neared midnight as Richard, settled on the couch with a blanket, watched the embers fade in the fireplace. Sophie, seated in the armchair beside him, took a final sip of tea. "Thank you for not leaving," she said, breaking the silence. Richard smiled, closing his eyes as the warmth of the fireplace and that home enveloped him. "I'll never leave again," he replied, with the certainty of someone who had finally found his place. And while the world outside remained cold and silent, in that small house, a new story was beginning to be written. Dawn arrived quietly, tinting the sky with soft shades of pink and gold, as the morning mist rose slowly from the fields, enveloping the little house in an ethereal aura. Richard woke on the couch, his body warmed by the blanket and his soul by something far greater, the presence of the daughter he'd just discovered, and the reunion with a love that, though silenced by time, had never been extinguished. He rose slowly, crossed the living room, and through the window gazed at the sleeping landscape as the faint aroma of fresh coffee began to spread through the air. In the kitchen, Sophie was already up, stirring the kettle with calm, routine movements. She saw him and smiled, a serene smile, as if recognizing at last that this was no longer a distant dream but a tangible reality. "Good morning," he said, approaching. "Good morning. Sleep well?" she asked with genuine concern. Richard nodded, running a hand through his hair. "Better than I have in years." Sophie smiled, offering him a cup of coffee. They sat at the table, side by side, in silence, sharing the complicity of those who no longer need many words to understand each other. "Emily's still sleeping," Sophie commented, glancing upstairs. "She'll be happy to know you stayed." Richard smiled, moved. "I'm happy I stayed too." They lingered there for a few minutes, in silence, listening only to the discreet song of the birds waking among the trees and the gentle clink of cutlery. Suddenly, Sophie raised her gaze, as if making a difficult decision. "Richard," she began, hesitant, "what happens now?" He took a deep breath, resting his elbows on the table. "I don't know, I just know I can't go back to that life, as if nothing happened." She nodded, understanding. "I never wanted to disrupt your life, never wanted you to feel obligated to anything." Richard took her hand, squeezing it firmly. "It's not about obligation, Sophie. It's about love, about everything I lost and now want to reclaim, if you'll let me." Her eyes filled with tears, but she smiled, squeezing his hand tightly. "I always hoped for this, even when I told myself I didn't." At that moment, Emily's small, hurried footsteps echoed from upstairs. Soon she appeared on the stairs, hair disheveled and pajamas still rumpled. "Good morning," she said, running to hug her mother and then Richard. He lifted her into his arms, hugging her tightly. "Good morning, Princess," Emily laughed, settling into his lap, as if that had always been her place. "Are you having breakfast with us?" she asked. "Of course," Richard replied, setting her beside him. As they ate, Emily shared stories about school, friends, farm outings, and Richard listened with absolute attention, as if trying to absorb every detail, every nuance, every expression, reclaiming the years he hadn't lived, but that now presented themselves as a unique opportunity. After breakfast, Emily tugged his hand. "Come, I want to show you something." Richard followed her to the backyard, where she pointed to an old bicycle leaning against the wall. "I learned to ride it alone, but sometimes I fall." Richard smiled, approaching. "Want me to help?" She nodded, grabbing her helmet and climbing onto the bike. Richard held it steady as she began to pedal. "Don't let go," she pleaded, laughing. "I won't let go, trust me." And so they went, circling the yard while Sophie watched from the porch, her heart swelling with emotion and joy. Seeing Richard and Emily together, laughing, falling, getting up, was like witnessing a quiet, profound, everyday miracle. After a few laps, Emily stopped, breathless but happy. "You're good at this," she said, hugging him. "That's because I had the best teacher," he replied, stroking her hair. The day progressed, and the sky was now a clear blue, free of the previous night's storm. Sophie called them inside, as she needed to go to town for supplies. Richard offered to drive her, but she declined, saying she preferred to go alone to give him and Emily more time together. "You two have a lot to talk about," she said, smiling, before grabbing her bag and leaving. As Sophie drove off, Emily pulled Richard by the hand to the couch. "Want to see my drawings?" she asked, excited. "Of course," he replied, settling beside her. Emily spread dozens of colorful sheets across the rug. Houses, flowers, trees, and in many the same male figure with dark hair and a wide smile. "That's you," she said, pointing. Richard smiled, eyes brimming. "I'm glad you drew me, even without knowing me." Emily shrugged, as if it were the most natural thing. "I think I always knew you, even without knowing." Those words pierced Richard's heart, and he pulled her into a tight hug. "I love you, Emily, so much." She hugged him back strongly without words, but making it clear the feeling was mutual. When Sophie returned, she found them like that, embraced, asleep on the couch, with the drawings scattered across the floor. She smiled, moved, and approached quietly, covering them with a blanket. Then she sat in the armchair, watching them in silence, as if beholding a scene she'd waited her whole life to witness. The weeks that followed passed like a breeze. Richard reorganized his life, closed contracts, delegated tasks, sold properties, and finally decided he wouldn't return to the big city. He bought a house near Sophie's to stay close to Emily and build, at last, the family he'd always dreamed of. Each day was a discovery. He took Emily to school, helped with the crops, read bedtime stories, and, little by little, healed his own wounds too. One day, walking with Sophie along the road where they'd reunited, he stopped, holding her hand tightly. "Sophie, I want to ask you something." She looked at him, smiling. "What is it?" Richard took a deep breath, pulling a velvet box from his pocket. "Will you marry me?" Sophie's eyes widened, surprised, and then, laughing and crying at once, she nodded. "Yes, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, sealing not just a promise but the repair of a story interrupted. Emily, following from a distance, ran and hugged them both. "We'll be a real family," she shouted, overjoyed. Richard lifted her into his arms, embracing Sophie at the same time. "We already are, my princess. We already are." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky golden, they walked hand in hand down the road, ready to write, together, the next chapters of a story that, despite everything, had always belonged to them. The wedding took place a few months later, on a spring afternoon that seemed handcrafted by God himself. Wildflowers colored the field around the small wooden church, while the sweet scent of lavender mingled with the soft song of birds chirping among the blooming trees. Emily, dressed in a delicate white dress and holding a small bouquet of daisies, walked smiling beside Sophie, who radiated in a simple but elegant dress sewn by her own hands. Richard, standing at the altar in a light grey suit, wore a serene smile but couldn't hide the emotion brimming in his eyes. His closest friends and a few villagers formed the small audience witnessing that intimate, special moment. There was no luxury, no ostentation, but there was something Richard had never found in his years of wealth and power: truth. As Sophie walked toward him, her eyes locked on his, Richard felt the weight he'd carried his whole life dissolve, like mist dispelled by a gentle morning breeze. The pastor, an elderly man with a calm and kind voice, led the ceremony with the simplicity and depth the moment demanded. "Love," he began, looking at the couple, "is not made only of meetings but also of reunions. It's not just about presence but also about forgiveness. Today, before all, you choose not only to love but to rewrite, together, a story that life interrupted, but that time could not erase." Richard squeezed Sophie's hand tightly, and she smiled, moved. Emily, beside them, held both their hands, a living bridge connecting that love to the future. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife and they kissed, The applause was spontaneous and warm, accompanied by Emily's wide smile as she jumped to hug them. "Now we're a real family," she said, laughing, as Richard lifted her into his arms and embraced Sophie with the other. That afternoon, the celebration was simple. In the backyard of the house, with food prepared by neighbors, music played by a violinist friend, and abundant joy. Richard, accustomed to dinners in starred restaurants and gala parties, discovered there the true pleasure of a celebration: shared laughter, tight hugs, the sense of belonging. As he danced with Sophie under the lights strung between the trees, he whispered in her ear, "Thank you, Hatton, for waiting for me." She smiled, resting her head on his chest. "I never stopped waiting for you, even when I thought I had." And as they twirled slowly, Emily ran through the yard with other children, her white dress now stained with dirt and grass, but her face lit up with a happiness that needed no explanation. The days that followed were of peace and building. Richard, who had lived among luxury apartments and five-star hotels, adapted with joy to the simple country life, waking early to tend the garden, learning from Sophie to make homemade bread, and spending hours with Emily exploring nearby forest trails, teaching her about cars while she taught him about butterflies and medicinal plants. One day, as they worked together on the old Mustang, Emily asked, "Dad, are you really staying forever?" Richard smiled, wiping grease from his hands and looking into her eyes. "Forever, my princess." She hugged him tightly, as if sealing an unbreakable pact. Sophie, watching from the porch, couldn't hold back tears. That simple, everyday scene was the realization of the miracle she'd silently prayed for over the years. Time passed, and little by little Richard also reconciled with other ghosts of the past. He visited his parents' graves, forgave himself for his mistakes, reconnected with old friends, and, most importantly, rediscovered himself. One late afternoon, sitting on the porch with Sophie and Emily, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and purple, he confided, "I never thought I could be so happy, so fulfilled, away from everything I thought made me complete." Sophie smiled, leaning against his shoulder. "Sometimes you have to lose everything to find what really matters." He nodded, watching Emily, who, at that moment, ran through the field, chasing a blue butterfly. "And I found it." That same summer, Richard decided to start a community workshop in the village, teaching young people to fix cars and farm equipment. Inspired by Emily and the memory of her grandfather, who had taught her from a young age, he saw it as a chance to pass on not just technical skills, but values of responsibility, patience, and perseverance. Emily, of course, was his favorite assistant. Together, they disassembled engines, painted parts, and welcomed villagers who previously had to travel miles to get their vehicles repaired. "What if you take over the workshop one day?" Richard teased. Emily laughed, proud. "You bet. I already know how to handle the carburetor." They both laughed while Sophie, from the porch, prepared lemonade and watched a scene that, though simple, represented a quiet victory over time, missed encounters, and past pains. One Sunday afternoon, sitting under the apple tree shading the yard, Sophie asked, "Ever regretted it?" Richard looked at her, surprised. "Regretted what?" "Coming here, staying." He took her hand, tenderly. "Never. If I regretted anything, it was taking so long." She smiled, moved, while Emily, lying on the grass beside them, listened to the conversation without speaking, but absorbing every word, every gesture, as if building within herself an indelible emotional memory. The seasons changed, summer gave way to autumn, and golden leaves began to cover the yard. Emily grew, and Richard saw in her each day more of Sophie's traits: courage, sweetness, stubbornness, and also his own, a passion for engines, a curious and determined gaze. One late afternoon, as they swept the yard's leaves together, Emily asked, "Dad, do you think life always gives a second chance?" Richard smiled, pausing the broom and looking at her. "I think so, but not always in the way we imagine. Sometimes it surprises us." She nodded, thoughtful. "Like you and Mom." He laughed. "Exactly." And embracing her, he felt once again that unshakable certainty that he was finally exactly where he was meant to be. That same night, as the family dined by candlelight due to a storm that had knocked out the power, Richard looked around. Sophie was smiling, Emily was animatedly telling a school story, and he, silently, thanked God, or fate, or life, for this second chance he never imagined he'd have. And as the rain fell outside, strong and serene, he understood in fullness that sometimes it takes an engine stalling, a road falling silent, a storm arriving, for life to find a new path at last. Winter came early that year, blanketing the fields in white and turning the small wooden house into a warm, welcoming refuge, where the fire in the hearth crackled day and night, spreading a woody aroma that mingled with the scent of freshly baked bread and chamomile tea. Richard, now fully adapted to the village's quiet routine, spent mornings helping Sophie with household maintenance and afternoons teaching Emily small repairs in the workshop, which had become a reference point for the entire region. On those cold days, the family developed a habit of gathering after dinner to play cards or read books by the light of an old lamp that, despite flickering during the winter's frequent power outages, always seemed to hold on heroically. It was a time of retreat, intimacy, and a silent happiness that, though not flaunted on social media or celebrated in headlines, was deep, tangible, and above all, true. One such night, as snow fell outside, tracing fleeting arabesques on the window pane, Emily asked, "Dad, what was your life like before us?" Richard leaned back in the armchair, looking at his daughter with that mix of pride and melancholy only parents know. "It was empty, Emily. I had many things, houses, cars, money, but I didn't have what really matters, you two." She nodded, thoughtful, then smiled. "Now you do," he smiled back, pulling her into a hug. "Now I do." Sophie, watching from the kitchen, discreetly wiped a tear, grateful for this man who years ago had left in search of something he thought essential, but in the end discovered the essential was right there, in front of him, all along. The next morning, Richard received a letter. The formal stamped envelope came from the city. An old business partner invited him to resume a major project, offering a prominent position, $1 million salary, and all the perks he once considered indispensable. He read it slowly, savoring each word, not with desire but with a curious detachment, like someone observing a valuable object they no longer wish to own. Sophie noticed his distant gaze and approached. "News?" she asked, pouring him coffee. Richard looked up, handing her the letter. She read it in silence, then met his eyes, saying nothing but understanding everything. "What will you do?" He smiled, slipping an arm around her shoulders. "I think I'll let it pass." Sophie smiled, resting her head on his chest. "I knew you would." Richard kissed her hair, and in that moment he was fully aware that, had he received that letter years ago, he would have dropped everything to chase another conquest. But now, sitting in that simple kitchen with the woman he loved by his side and his daughter playing in the yard, no offer in the world could make him give up this new life. A few days later, during a walk through the snow-covered forest, Emily stopped, scooped up a handful of snow and threw it at her father, laughing. Richard feigned indignation and retaliated, sparking a snowball fight that had them rolling in the clearing, laughing like children. Sophie, further ahead, watched the scene, mentally photographing every second, knowing those moments would be remembered forever as undeniable proof that love is always stronger than time and wrong choices. When they tired, they lay side by side in the soft snow, gazing at the clear blue sky where a flock of birds flew in formation. "Dad," Emily began, her voice sweet, "do you think people can really change?" Richard turned to her, smiling. "I think so. I think changing is the best thing we can do, when we realize the old path didn't make us happy." She nodded, closing her eyes and breathing deeply the icy air, as if absorbing that lesson to keep forever. The winter was long and harsh, but, curiously, also the happiest time Richard had ever lived. While the world outside seemed asleep, inside that small house life pulsed with intensity. Emily read her first novels, Sophie created new recipes to surprise the family, and Richard, between workshop repairs and nights by the fire, saw himself reborn, with a clear purpose and a full love. One night at the end of a dinner celebrating Sophie's birthday, Emily, in a spontaneous gesture, raised her glass of juice and proposed a toast. "To our family," she said, with a smile that lit up the room. Richard and Sophie clinked glasses, moved, and as Sophie blew out the cake's candles, Richard watched them with a feeling he couldn't put into words, but knew with absolute certainty was what he'd always sought: fulfillment. With spring's arrival, the house filled with color again. Emily's sunflowers began to bloom, bees buzzed among the wildflowers, and the trees, once bare, displayed vibrant leaves dancing in the breeze. Life was reborn. In a perfect cycle nature never forgets to fulfill. One day, walking with Sophie through the field, Richard stopped and took her hand. "You know, I always thought happiness was something grand, distant, something to be conquered after great effort, great sacrifices." She looked at him, smiling. "And now?" He took a deep breath, gazing at the vast green before him. "Now I know happiness is this. Being here, with you, with Emily, living one day at a time, without rush, without fear." Sophie squeezed his hand and rested her head on his shoulder. "Me too." As they walked, Richard realized how that love, once so tumultuous and marked by missed connections, now flowed with ease and peace. They no longer needed grand declarations or extravagant promises. A knowing glance, a touch of hands, a silent embrace, and above all the certainty that despite lost time, they had found each other again, stronger, more mature, and more aware of the value of each shared second. That same afternoon, Richard and Emily worked on the Mustang, now not just a symbol of his passion for cars, but the milestone of the reunion that had changed their lives forever. As they adjusted the final pieces, Emily asked, "Dad, when this car breaks down again, will you be able to fix it?" Richard laughed, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Of course, and if I can't, I have the best mechanic in the world to help me." She laughed loudly, hugging him. In that embrace, Richard felt once again the strength of a love that, silent and patient, had waited all those years to finally manifest in all its power. When they finished the repair, Richard called Sophie for a drive. They all climbed into the Mustang, and along the road, cutting through the blooming fields, drove slowly with the windows open, feeling the gentle spring breeze caress their faces. As he drove, Richard glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Emily smiling in the back seat, her blonde hair fluttering in the wind. He looked at Sophie, who held his hand tenderly, and in that moment, he knew, with absolute conviction, that this was the most perfect moment of his life. And so they continued down the road, no longer as three people brought together by chance, but as a family, finally complete, redeemed, and blessed by the silent grace of a second chance. The days flowed with the lightness known only to reconciled lives. The routine, once marked by unavoidable commitments, endless meetings, and a loneliness disguised as power, was now woven with the small, silent miracles of daily life. The smell of baking bread in the morning, lazy afternoons in the yard, bike rides along the tree-lined road, and nights warmed by the fireplace, where stories were told, memories shared, and dreams, now collective, began to take shape. Richard, who once didn't know what to do with free time, now filled it with simple but deeply meaningful activities, teaching Emily to change car oil in the workshop, tending plants with Sophie, restoring old furniture for the house, and often taking long walks through the fields, just to gaze at the horizon and silently thank the life he never imagined he could have. On one such walk, a summer morning, he found Emily sitting under the apple tree, a sketchbook in her lap. He approached slowly, sat beside her, and with a curious smile asked, "What are you drawing, princess?" She turned the sketchbook, revealing a familiar scene, him, Sophie, and her, holding hands, walking down the road. The lines were still childish, but the feeling overflowed in every stroke, every color. "It's us," she explained simply. Richard smiled, moved, and pulled her into a tight hug. "It's beautiful, just like you," she laughed, resting her head on his chest as the breeze gently swayed the apple tree's leaves, scattering white petals across the grass. That same night, as they dined by candlelight, Sophie looked at Richard with a playful smile and asked, "Have you gotten used to life here, or do you still miss the city?" He looked at her, pretending to think, then replied, "I think I don't miss anything, only what I lost, but that in a way I've now reclaimed." Sophie smiled, reaching across the table to take his hand tenderly. "And what did you lose?" Richard squeezed her hand, looking at Emily, who was trying to balance a piece of bread on her fork. "Time. But now I understand that even lost time can be transformed when you have love." Sophie nodded, moved. "I always believed that." The words hung over the table like a silent blessing, sealing another chapter of their story of reunion and redemption. As months passed, Richard realized that the small community had embraced him as one of their own. The man once seen as an untouchable millionaire cloistered in his fortress of pride and fear, was now the neighbor who helped with harvests, the friend who fixed tractors, the father who attended school performances, cheering and tearing up with each of Emily's achievements. One afternoon during the annual harvest festival, as children ran among the stalls and adults danced to a local band, Richard and Sophie swayed slowly under the lights strung among the tree branches. The air was thick with joy and gratitude, and Richard felt deeply rooted in that land, that community, that family. As they danced, Sophie looked into his eyes and with a serene smile said, "I never thought I'd see you like this. So fulfilled." Richard laughed, kissing her forehead. "Neither did I, but now I see that everything I lived, every choice, even the mistakes, brought me here." She nodded, resting her head on his chest. "And I'm glad they did." That night, as they returned home, Emily, exhausted from playing, fell asleep in the Mustang's back seat. Richard drove slowly along the moonlit road, while Sophie gazed out the window at the silhouettes of passing trees. "You know," he began, breaking the silence, "sometimes I think about how it all started. If the car hadn't broken down that day, maybe none of this would have happened." Sophie smiled, looking at him. "I don't think the car broke down by chance." He nodded, gently squeezing her hand resting on his knee. "Neither do I." And so they continued down the road in silence, letting the night envelop their family with its peace and mystery. With time, Richard began keeping a diary, something he'd never done before. In it, he recorded his thoughts, reflections, the small daily moments, and above all, his deep gratitude for his new life. One night, as he wrote by the firelight, Emily approached, curious. "What are you writing, Dad?" He smiled, closing the notebook. "Just some things, so I never forget." She sat beside him, resting against his shoulder. "Can I read it someday?" Richard kissed her head. "Of course. One day it'll be yours." Emily smiled, content, and stayed there silent, feeling the warmth of the fire and the security of her father's embrace. The following spring, Richard and Sophie decided to expand the house, building a larger room for Emily and a porch overlooking the blooming field. They worked together on the project, with help from neighbors, and in a few months the house, already their dream home, became even more welcoming. One late afternoon, as they finished painting the porch, they sat side by side watching the sunset paint the sky in golden and purple hues. "Look at that," Richard said, pointing to Emily, who was running through the field, chasing a butterfly as she always did. "She seems so free." Sophie smiled, leaning against him. "Because she is, and I think we are too now." Richard embraced her, gazing at the scene that once again confirmed that happiness lies not in grand achievements, but in the small moments shared with those we love. The years that followed were marked by that same peace, that same silent, solid love. Richard, Sophie, and Emily built not just a house but a story of redemption, reunion, and unconditional love. And whenever the Mustang needed a tune-up, it was Emily who took charge, now a teenager, with the same skill and passion she'd shown years before when she fixed the car that, unbeknownst to them, had been the vehicle that led, literally, to their transformative reunion. One sunny morning, as Emily worked on the Mustang in the workshop, Richard watched, proud. "You're getting better at this every day," he said, smiling. She smiled back. "I learned from the best." Richard pulled her into a hug, and looking around at the workshop, the house in the distance, Sophie reading on the porch, felt once again that deep, unshakable certainty that even though the road had been long and full of detours, fate, in the end, would always bring them back home. Time moved forward gently, as if reluctant to disrupt the harmony newly established. Emily graduated with honors from university, specializing in automotive engineering, and soon received multiple job offers from major companies, but her heart, as always, knew where it belonged. A few months after graduation, she returned to the village, her eyes sparkling and her mind brimming with new dreams and projects. Richard and Sophie welcomed her with tears in their eyes and open arms. The house, which had felt too large in her absence, filled again with her laughter, her stories, and her enthusiasm. Emily didn't just return. She brought new ideas. She proposed expanding the workshop, turning that symbolic space into a hub of innovation and learning, where young people could not only fix engines, but also build new machines, learn about sustainable energy, and above all, find a purpose, just as she had. Richard, with pride and emotion, supported every step of the project. They spent months working side by side, as in the old days, But now, with Emily taking the lead, guiding him with the confidence and wisdom only those who have found their true path can display. At the opening of the new space, the entire community gathered, friends, neighbors, former workshop students and new apprentices who, inspired by this family's story, now had a place to grow. The Mustang, restored to its prime, was positioned at the entrance, a silent monument to the day that forever changed their lives. That day, as she cut the inaugural ribbon, Emily looked at her parents with tears in her eyes and, before everyone, declared, "If I'm here today, if we are who we are, it's because one day on an empty road my father stopped and let himself be helped by a little girl with a toolbox." Never underestimate the power of an encounter. Never doubt what a gesture of kindness can spark. The applause echoed through the village as Richard and Sophie embraced her, moved, aware that this moment was not just a celebration, but the consecration of a life rebuilt on the solid foundations of love, forgiveness, and a second chance. Later that night, after the party, the three sat on the porch as they had so many times, gazing at the starry sky and listening in the distance to the nocturnal song of crickets. Richard, with a serene voice, broke the silence. "Who would have thought? It all started with a broken car." Emily laughed, resting her head on his shoulder. "It wasn't the car, Dad. It was the heart that needed fixing." Sophie smiled, holding both their hands, and added, "And you did it. Together." They stayed there in silence, letting love flow between them, unhurried, needing no more words. In that moment, Richard looked at the starry sky, felt the gentle breeze caress his face, and understood, with a clarity only years can provide, that life is not made of the possessions we accumulate or the victories we flaunt, but of the bonds we build, the people we choose to love, and the stories that, even when interrupted, can always be rewritten. And so, on that tranquil night, he knew with absolute certainty that his story at last was complete.